You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 377 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about Rand Paul's efforts to improve the U.S. relationship with Iran. I got news on Turkey and the S-400 and F-35, and some updates on the Korean peace process. Please take the time to share the show or recommend it to a friend. Best place to find the show online is at the Libertarian Institute, where the show, along with my daily news roundup, are now featured in the right-hand column of the homepage. Once you start to listen to the show and you like it, make sure you subscribe to the show somewhere. Most of the shows are on current events, and so the way you get the most out of the show is by listening to every one. Shows on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you can find podcasts, and if you can, leave me a rating and review there. And last, if you want to become a patron to the show and get in on the monthly live stream, July 24th, I'll be doing live stream 9 p.m. Eastern Time. $5 a month at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus will get you into that. I want to start the show off by talking about Eric Garner and the lack of justice in that trial. Here we have a man who was strangled to death by police for selling loose cigarettes, and nobody ends up going to jail. And I think the, question of justice and who's responsible in this case translates well to why nobody is ever held responsible for killing civilians in U.S. wars either. So here you have a case where I'm sure this young man became a police officer with the idea that he was going to go out and save lives. And hey, in every TV show I watch, every movie I watch, every school you're a part of, that's what they tell you about police officers. We had a police officer in our building, and certainly everybody, got the impression from that guy that, hey, cops are people that protect you, not people who potentially strangle you to death for a nonviolent, quote unquote crime. I'm sure that police officer didn't want to strangle Eric Garner to death. I'm guessing that if he could have it play out his way, Eric Garner would have laid on the ground, put his hands behind his back, and let 6 police officers topple on top of him, putting him in painful and, potentially injuring him with, the way they sit on people's necks and stuff like that. But anyways, they do that. They throw him in the back of a squad car. And, it's all done. That's not necessarily a humane situation, but it's, far short of strangling somebody. However, the way our society works and the way everybody thinks, well, the way most people think, is that if you're a police officer, you have to enforce the rule of law. And if somebody doesn't want to comply with that rule, no matter what you say it is, then you have to escalate to the point of killing them. And that's just the way it works, whether it's a taillight, selling CDs, selling loose cigarettes, selling marijuana. The idea is that once an officer catches you, you must comply, and that officer could do whatever he needs to do to get you to comply with his orders. And hell, even if you're innocent and didn't even do anything wrong, if the officer thinks you're guilty and is giving you orders, you're, expected to follow. And so because we live in this really unfortunate reality where that's apparently what everybody believes, and, we kind of are all stuck going along with it, it kind of doesn't feel right to hold the police officer 100% responsible for what happened. Yeah, maybe he could have done something differently, and we all hope and imagine that if we were in his position, we would have. But, that's a really tough thing to say, because most people, when they're, told to do something for their job, I feel like just do it. And so the same thing ends up happening with the U.S. foreign policy, where nobody's ever held responsible because, even the officers who maybe gave the direct order, like, hey, go arrest this guy, or hey, go raid that building over there, and then either civilians get shot or somebody gets strangled to death, on a street corner in New York. People say, well, it's really not fair to blame the sergeant all the way either, because, he was given order by his superiors that he's supposed to, clean up this neighborhood or make sure there's no weapons in this certain area of a city. And he had, intelligence or a reason to believe that somebody was doing something they shouldn't be doing here. And so, what he's supposed to do by his job is just to order that to happen. And then, you work your way up the chain until you end up with at some level, there's probably a politician telling, somebody within the military or the police force that this is what we want you to do. So, we don't want people selling loose cigarettes on street corners. It doesn't really look good. They say it contributes to like other kinds of crime or something like that. Maybe they claim it's some kind of gateway crime. You start off selling loose cigarettes and then you start selling pot, or, there's probably some stupid theories like that. Or, they say that we need to secure this country to make sure that no terrorists ever come to America, or we need to secure this neighborhood to wage a counterinsurgency war. That way the people realize that Western democracy enforced upon them by the U.S. military is better than whatever ruler they had before, and will love, our Americans and then adopt our ways. But then, the politicians will say, well, you really can't blame us because what we told them to do, which is, go create democracy overseas or clean up our streets, didn't involve killing people. So I guess if I had it my way, the politicians would be the ones that would be held responsible here, especially because so many of these times, it's not the first time. This isn't the first person that's been killed while police try to enforce a nonviolent crime. It's not the first even war at this point. Hell, we're not even on our first genocide of seeing the impact of sanctions and blockades of countries. And so I guess, like I said, if I had my way, that would be the level that we would start locking people up at. Certainly, again, the officer in this case and, the people who kill innocent people overseas, there's got to be some kind of responsibility for, the soldier or the cop. Whether that's taking the badge away and, taking the uniform away, or actual jail sentences. If you're locking up the politicians, I think that's the first way to go. One reason I just don't want to throw all the blame at the individual soldiers or police officers is I think this is one like kind of the tricks that the politicians use by placing blame on people that everybody knows are kind of not worthy of the full blame. Makes it so that people, I guess, don't want to blame anybody or hold anyone responsible and just kind of say, shrug, well, this is kind of, the system that the way things are and we really don't know what to do about it. So, hey, what's on TV? All right, moving on here. We have Mark Esper now as the nominee to be the new Secretary of Defense. He's being questioned by Elizabeth Warren in committee, and she's saying, hey, will you commit to, recusing yourself from all decisions involving Raytheon, your former employer? Esper said no to this, and she got pretty upset and was saying that, hey, you're still owed $1 million by this company, so isn't it kind of a problem that you're going to be making the decisions? Now, in one sense, I'm glad that, Senator Warren is pointing this out, and, we need more exposure that all the, top defense officials, people who end up working in the State Department and think tanks, a lot of them at one point in time were working for the weapon makers too. So there's a lot of conflict of interest there. Now, I don't think him recusing himself, whatever that actually means, has any impact at all. I mean, if you look at the last, acting Secretary of Defense, Patrick Shanahan, he said, I'm going to recuse myself from all decisions involving Boeing, but the Pentagon made huge purchases of Boeing products during that time anyways. And it's because, even his underlings know that, hey, the Secretary of Defense used to be a Boeing employee, so I should pick Boeing products because he probably has a lot of friends there. That's probably, maybe where he's going back after he retires from here. And I'm sure he likes the products because he used to work there. So I'll go ahead and, pit those for, the contracts as a way to suck up to the boss. The new National Defense Authorization Act has now passed both houses and is in committee. As I said before, as this bill comes out of committee, we'll have a better idea of what's actually going to be in it. Maybe good stuff involving, not selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, withdrawing support for Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen. On the other hand, that all could be stripped out during committee and we could get a bill filled with just more spending and more powers for the president. Donald Trump has taken $42 million in funds that were intended to be aid to Latin American countries. I believe these were Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, and has given that money to Juan Guaido to run his now very failed attempt to seize power in Venezuela. I mean, at this point, it's coming out that there's corruption within his, administration doesn't even feel like the right word because he's not really president of anything. He's a self-declared president. So in his self-declared presidential administration, there's a lot of corruption, and I'm sure most of this money will be stolen and not used really to benefit anybody at all in Venezuela. not sure why Trump is doing this. I would think if I were him, I would just want this thing to go away, or at the very least for Guaido to go away. I mean, this guy has been an absolute failure as far as it goes. He declared himself president. He was, I guess supposed to rally the people, and none of it ever happened. It worked out. In fact, all Maduro's rallies end up being bigger than Guaido's, and it doesn't even seem like he has widespread support among the opposition. This again, like the story involving Fred Fleitz, who I butchered his last name on the last show, but this is the guy possibly replacing Dan Coates as Director of National Intelligence. Worries me as a sign that Bolton may still have some influence in the Trump administration. I know that after he was marooned to Mongolia, there was a lot of speculation and hope that this meant he was on his way out the door as the National Security Advisor. However, he's, from my understanding, one of the, main proponents of this intervention in Venezuela. And if Trump is, now further committing to it, it could be a sign that Bolton has the presidency here still. Libya has extradited the brother of the Manchester bombing. I think this was the Ariana Grande concert where a bunch of kids were slaughtered by some maniac veteran of the NATO side of the war in Libya. And so this is, kind of just blowback in its most disgusting form, where you have these poor little girls in the UK who are, excited for their Ariana Grande concert. They end up being, I'm sure all of them are traumatized, and will be deeply impacted by this event for the rest of their lives. But unfortunately, a dozen or so of them end up killed. And, while everybody rightfully blames the bomber, nobody looks at, the U.S. and the UK government for, backing and supporting these kind of groups against Muammar Gaddafi. It seems unlikely to me that bomb goes off at that concert without the U.S. backed war against Gaddafi in 2011. This is a story that I'm sure will develop over time. I don't have a whole lot to say about today, but I think it will have some significance. And that is the head of the IAEA says that he is stepping down. This, of course, is the International Watchdog Group on Nuclear Weapons. This is a group tasked with enforcing the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. The concern I have is the IAEA turns into a group like the OPCW, the Chemical Weapons Watchdog Group, heavily influenced by the West, and starts putting together bad reports and bad evidence claiming that states the U.S. doesn't like are working on nuclear technologies that they aren't. So the IAEA will likely play an important role, assuming that any kind of nuclear agreement or peace agreement gets done with North Korea. Right now, the threat to talks is apparently there's some planned U.S. South Korean war games that North Korea wants canceled. The U.S. describes these games as defensive in nature, and so somehow defensive war games are okay. My hope is that the U.S. either scales them down or does something good enough to appease the North Koreans on this and everybody could go home happy. It seems very stupid to let these small war games that if the U.S. really wants to, I'm sure they could relocate them somewhere if they feel like there's a real need to make sure all their systems work or something in case of a North Korean invasion that'll never come. But it seems really dumb to let that get in the way of a potential end to the Korean War and a huge win for Donald Trump's presidency by getting some kind of a deal done with North Korea. From my understanding, this freeze agreement talk where North Korea would just halt their nuclear program where it is, maybe start to close some facilities in exchange for the United States starting to, implement some security guarantees and sanctions relief. Apparently, Kim Jong-un is really pushing for security guarantees, although everything I have read hasn't given any indication as to what kind of security guarantees those would be and what the U.S. would have to do to meet those. Russia is going to continue to hold Ukrainian sailors that were detained during the Strait of Kerch event. This, of course, is the small water passageway that spans the Crimean Peninsula and the Russian mainland, separating the Sea of Azov from the Black Sea. So, there's a tense situation for that reason with the whole Ukrainian civil war still being on a slow burn. And then this war, like Syria, the United States and Russia find themselves on opposite sides. I'm not quite sure why Russia is continuing to hold these sailors and not maybe making a big press deal about returning them back to Ukraine. But there have been some talks between Russia and the Ukrainian leader. So maybe we could see a release of these men soon. And hopefully start to winding down this civil war in Ukraine. An interesting story came out of the Ukrainian civil war, and that is some extreme right-wingers in Italy were caught with a French air-to-air missile. Now, I did read some reports saying that this missile is 20 plus years old, and so who knows how many times it's changed hands before actually getting into the hands of these. Some sources describe them as Nazis, but certainly far right-wingers that were in support of the Ukrainian government. There's a great article at Moon of Alabama that I'll link to in the show notes page explaining how the media really got this story wrong in trying to pin the fighters, or the right-wing, fascists, to the separatist side in Ukraine, when in reality they were supportive of the government side. Now, of course, nobody listens to this show will be surprised by this, because I've been talking all along here about how the Ukrainian government that's backed by the United States has a very strong neo-Nazi faction. The U.S. has applied sanctions to 5 people in Myanmar for the ongoing ethnic cleansing campaign against the Rohingya. The Rohingya are a minority group of Muslims. I think close to 1 million of them were pushed out of the country at the start of this thing. But since, this has been on a slow burn, and there's continued reports of the, I believe, mainly Buddhist army in Myanmar continuing to carry out war crimes against innocent Rohingya civilians. And I say that not necessarily as an endorsement of the sanctions. I'm opposed to sanctions. They're kind of warfare no matter what. But if there are people in the world to be sanctioned, it's the kind of people that carry out war crimes. So, we started looking at Congress first. The Ayatollah says Iran will continue to withdraw from its commitments to the JCPOA until the European countries comply. Now, this is, I think, should be an interesting standpoint, right? That the U.S. is able to leave the JCPOA to break the deal, and Iran says they'll continue to comply with it as long as the Europeans do. And this is maybe a path that the U.S. could take, is just by telling their allies, like, hey, we're going to back off of that secondary sanctions commitment. All of you could, continue to do business with Iran, just the United States isn't going to. I guess that would mean an end to Trump's maximum pressure campaign, but at the same time, it's clearly not going to work, and Iran's just going to leave the deal, and everybody kind of understands that the U.S. broke it first, and, the Trump administration runs around all day long saying we're applying crippling sanctions on Iran. Rand Paul played a round of golf with the president, and apparently this round of golf netted a huge victory, and he got permission to talk to the Iranian foreign minister. As far as I understand, this hasn't happened yet, so still fingers crossed. It could definitely be undone. Who knows who the president talks to and changes his mind. Says, I never said that to Rand Paul. That guy's crazy, just like his haircut. But if there are 2 people, in the U.S. government and the Iranian government that would pit to talk to each other to say common sense things and come to some kind of decent understanding, would be the Iranian foreign minister and Senator Rand Paul. Also could be a good sign that Senator Paul is gaining more, weight in, influencing Donald Trump. And while Rand Paul isn't perfect on war, he's certainly better than Donald Trump and anybody he has advising him right now. As I mentioned on Monday's shows, Turkey has started to take possession of the S-400 air defense system from Russia, and the United States has long threatened to sanction Turkey in response and withdraw them from the F-35 program and not sell them any F-35s. There's been a lot of threats and change this whole time, except really for the past couple weeks, after Donald Trump talked to the Turkish leader Erdogan at the G20 summit, and now you have Donald Trump giving statements saying that it's unfair that Turkey is being kicked out of the F-35 program, and that this was all Barack Obama's fault for not selling Turkey the Patriot missile system in the first place. I'm not so sure I believe Trump's narrative, but I haven't done enough research on it yet to be sure. But from my understanding, I think Turkey chose the S-400 missile system over the Patriot missile system because it's cheaper and better. Now, the U.S. has officially kicked Turkey out of the F-35 program. According to, all the military people, it's too big of a strategic problem to give Turkey both the S-400 and the F-35. They say that Russia will be able to collect too much data and intelligence on the F-35. Seems plausible to me that that's true. And I really don't care if the U.S. sells F-35s to Turkey or not. I suppose I prefer they didn't. Although it does look like Lockheed Martin's balance sheet will not be hurting, and they're just looking to shift these sales to places in Eastern Europe. Sanctions are supposed to happen, but they haven't yet. I think there's a U.S. law that says if countries import the S-400, we will sanction them. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops in the coming weeks here, and what kind of reaction people have if Trump decides not to sanction Turkey. And of course, that will start to have more impacts on things like the Syrian civil war. Maybe is Trump not sanctioning Turkey here going to be some kind of agreement to not attack the Syrian Kurds? That makes it a lot easier for Donald Trump to decide to leave Syria if that's really what he wants to do. I know Turkey is having a lot of disputes with their neighbors right now, looking to exercise more control over the kind of northern Cyprus area and that little corner of the Mediterranean Sea and the oil rights underneath of it. Interesting times we live in. Anyways, I hope you liked the show this week. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, checkpointasia.net. The show is up there now. The site's run by my good friend Marco Marianovich. Check me out on Twitter at KYAAALE, and the private Facebook group is just called Foreign Policy Focus.